Good afternoon, everyone. How's everybody doing? Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon here. My name is Ben Desjardins. I run product marketing at Snyk. Part of that role involves me doing a lot of market research on the state of different trends, technology adoption, not just across Snyk customers, but also across the market at large. And so what we're going to talk about today is specifically AI. Now, I'm sure every session you feel like you're probably at this point getting hammered over the head with AI this week. It's, the unavoidable topic, right? What I'm going to talk to you about is some research specifically that we've done around AI adoption and Gen AI code development adoption. And I'm going to talk you through what we're starting to see as an emergence of a good set of guidelines for how you do this in a safe and secure way. Our point of view at Snyk on AI is that it's not an if, and candidly, it's not even really a when anymore. The reality is, whether you know it or not, you have developers in all likelihood using Gen AI coding tools within your environments. And so this is much more of a how. How can you enable that fast innovation that AI promises while remaining secure? So when we put this session together, we were actually leveraging last year's research, but you are very, very lucky, hot off the presses. In fact, last week, we released our AI readiness report. So I'm going to touch on last year's research and some of the data there. But I'm going to talk mostly about this new data, new year, new data. So let's show you what's up to date and what's happening as it relates to what we call AI readiness. And I'll give you a little more information on how we break that down across two parameters of AI fitness and AI wellness. There were many, many really unique and important findings, we believe, but three sort of rose to the top in terms of the ones that we felt like were most informative in terms of the state of AI adoption within your organizations, but also guiding towards recommendations that we really think are going to help you embrace AI as a powerful, innovative tool in your development efforts. So let's get into the data, and as I said, we're going to start with just a quick highlight of some of the key findings of last year's data, and I refer to this as the storm that we see brewing as it relates to the combination of use of AI, points of view around AI, and how organizations are acting as they embrace these technologies. So on the far left, you can see over half of respondents acknowledged that there were significant security issues with their AI-generated code. A very alarming 75% of developers acknowledge that somewhere within their development shop, there are developers using these coding tools in an unauthorized fashion. And yet, and this is the sort of confounding takeaway for me, when asked what sorts of changes are you making to your security software development practices, as you can see, there are a lot of good, responsible approaches, but the number one action is nothing. The most common response was that organizations were not actually taking action to change their software development processes in response to the state of AI coding. So this is a real issue. So now let's get into the 2024 report. And as I said, we focus on what we call AI readiness. Now, to give you a little bit of insight into the methodology around this research, we surveyed around 400 companies of varied size, and we focused the questions towards three key persona categories. One was developers, one was application security professionals, and a third was the C-suite. Candidly, a combination of CISOs, CTOs, and I'll get into that in just a little bit. And we asked them some questions around two parameters, what we call wellness. I think of this as, is the mind willing? Do you have a motivation internally to embrace AI? And fitness, is the body able? Have you put in place the policies, the controls, the types of governance that you're going to need to approach AI code generation, or frankly, any aspect of AI adoption within your organization in a responsible and secure way? And you can see some of the sort of more detailed questions that we asked there under these two categories of fitness and wellness. As we entered the research phase, our hypothesis was that we would see this breakout in sort of three different ways across these three personas. We were relatively certain that the developers would be the most eager and the least encumbered as it relates to the state of potential security issues. So scoring very high from a fitness perspective as well as a wellness perspective. We felt like the CISOs were going to feel a lot of pressure, so their motivation, their wellness factor would score very high. But from a security perspective, fitness perspective, they would have concerns. And we anticipated the application security team sort of getting stretched in two different directions as a result of these different states of mind across the development team as well as the security leadership team. So this is the funny thing about research, right? You form these hypotheses before you put the study into market, and sometimes they just don't pan out at all exactly the way that you expected them to. But even when that happens, and sometimes for me, when that happens, it makes the findings even more interesting. It really forces you to sort of unpack what's going on here. And so I'll talk you through some of the steps that we've been taking to better understand these results. But let me just share with you at a high level what we saw. We generally saw the C-suite feeling very unencumbered, feeling like their organizations were ready, that the risk level was low. We saw the security teams very concerned about the state of development, the state of security coming in. Very logical, considering they are probably already seeing the increase in issues and alerts hitting their teams as organizations embrace AI. And with developers, we see a sort of two states of mind within developers, and some of this comes from our qualitative follow-up that we've done since gathering the data. We generally find that the more junior development teams are actually achieving some heightened levels of productivity as a result of use of these tools. But we're also finding the more mature and sophisticated developers not really seeing the returns and the results that they expected, and probably highlighting a little more of that sensitivity around security. The other thing you'll probably notice when you look at this slide is my hypothesis slide had these three segments very separated. The results really had them aggregated in a lot of different areas. And let me talk about some of those sort of aligned points of view. In some cases, that alignment we see as positive. There's a very well shared view on the use of AI coding tools. So these organizations are aware of the state of use of AI coding tools. There is also a common sense of urgency, and not necessarily as sort of board driven into the C-suite as we were thinking. We see that the urgency is driven much more around the recognition that these tools are going to be a key pillar for future innovation and productivity within their organizations, and they put rather than taking board pressure to adopt AI in some form or fashion within their operation, they're very focused on the competitive impacts and keeping pace with their competitors, which I think is a healthy mindset as you embrace new technologies. Some of the areas we saw common responses, frankly, were a little more concerning. And I'll get into some of these in a little more detail. We saw what I refer to as the common shrug as it relates to the state of policies and the state of policy specifically around the use of Gen AI coding within the organizations. As with the 2023 study, we saw a relatively high state of inactivity, sort of lack of proactive response to the security issues that were being found. And even before embracing these AI generated code technologies, a very light level of due diligence. And so I'll drill a little more detail on some of these sort of common and concerning areas of common points of view across those personas. So these are what we called out as the three most compelling findings from the study. First, that the C-suite is dramatically underestimating the risk level of AI gen coding tools. And they're overestimating the state of readiness for their organizations. The second is, while they're aware of the use of these tools, as I said, one of the sort of healthier elements of their common point of view, they all cite low state of policy, and so that's a sort of confounding and contradictory point of view. And then finally, the preparation that these organizations go into, we think is not where it needs to be. So let's drill into each of these in just a little more detail. So the first one is that the C-suite is underestimating the state of risk and overestimating the state of readiness. So when we asked the C-suite respondents, how would you rate your organization's security risk around the use of Gen AI coding tools, the C-suite was 5 times more likely than the AppSec teams to say that they're not risky at all. So typical response cues, top 2 box, the top box, not risky at all. 5 times more likely in the C-suite than the AppSec teams to say there's no risk here. Now again, as I said before, AppSec teams have a unique point of view here because they understand the pressure to use AI. They understand the state of application security posture that's being pursued within the organization, and they likely already see the insecure code coming from these development teams as they embrace the AI. The second question was, how would you rate your organization's readiness for AI coding? Now, if you remember, our hypothesis was that developers would be the most eager, the most sort of, let's go, we're ready to do this. Actually, the C-suite was twice as likely as the developers to say we are extremely ready to embrace AI. Now, as I said before, this is a typical thing, especially when you get very different quantitative results than you expect. We embarked on a stage of qualitative measures, sort of follow-up actions. We had as one example, we had a unique opportunity to speak with about 30 Snyk customers at an intimate event in New York, and it was really largely the C-suite. And so we wanted to understand, why do you think that this is occurring? One of the hypotheses was, well, tell us a little more about your methodology and who you talk to from a C-suite perspective. And what we did is we looked at those roles and we pulled those apart to sort of understand, well, maybe it's the CTO, who's probably feeling a little more pressure from the board to embrace AI than the CISO, who's saying these things like these are not risky and we're ready to go. In fact, was not the case at all. The CISOs were just as likely as the CTOs to give these more proactive and aggressive responses to the use of AI. The second piece is we discussed how is the C-suite maybe thinking about AI and the use of AI more generally within their organizations. I think as many of you know, and certainly you get a heavy dose of this as you walk around an event like this, C-suites are under a tremendous amount of pressure from the boards and competitive pressures to embrace AI as a means of driving faster innovation and optimizing their organizations. So the perspective was, well, it's in all likelihood, and bear in mind, this is input from security leadership. There's a likelihood that the C-suite is thinking about AI adoption in broader terms necessarily than just through the lens of Gen AI code assistance. The second key finding we found was the awareness level of the use of AI coding tools, and in most cases, unauthorized use of AI coding tools. Yet the point of view and the state of mind within these organizations and across personas really, as it relates to the state of policies on the use of these coding tools. Now, if you remember, this data set's very, very true to our 2023 results, where we could see it was over 75% of developers acknowledging that there was use somewhere within the development shop of unauthorized use of Gen AI coding tools. In this survey, across personas, so that was developers, across personas, we saw almost 2/3 in every single persona acknowledge the state of AI coding tools prevalent within their organizations. Yet when we asked them about the state of their security policies around AI coding tools, 2/3 also said that they described those policies as adequate, which was, at least the fourth box on your 5-box response tool. So there's a sort of a confounding situation there in terms of why across personas they would talk about policies as being adequate, yet acknowledge that 2/3 of their development teams are using these tools in unauthorized fashion. As we dug into the qualitative layer of this response, what we generally found was a point of view that the industry's kind of immature and early in its state of establishing frameworks, establishing policies. Certainly, as you probably all know, NIST has put in place AI frameworks and frameworks for secure adoption of AI, as have other industry associations, but they're still very new. And most organizations have very little experience with them. And then when you kind of push that past the framework state to talk about regulation, the regulators, the folks that we talked to following the study said regulators are probably 2 years behind the state of AI adoption and their ability to help put in place concrete requirements around the use of AI coding tools. So let's get into the third finding, which was really around what we saw as a lack of sufficient preparation and really going through a good, healthy amount of due diligence before introducing AI. In general, across the organization, we find this to be true, but in particular, this was specific to the use of Gen AI coding tools. So when we asked them, what types of preparation steps did you take before embracing these AI coding tools, fewer than 20% said that they were actually running a POC. Now, to us, this was pretty shocking. Certainly within our development teams, and true to any use of AI, we're putting in place proofs of concept, not just to understand the risks associated with it, but also to define your success measures, right? Which is a critical thing, especially if you're going to introduce new aspects of risk. You need to, at a minimum, make sure that those risks are counterbalanced by an appropriate level of benefit that you're getting from adoption of that technology. The second question related to this is we asked what were the number one barriers to adoption of coding tools, and security across all three personas was identified as the number one barrier to adoption. Again, very similar to our 2023 results, where we saw security called out as a significant hurdle to the use of these tools in an efficient way. And then when we asked, what's the state of training developers when you're putting these new tools in their hands, And 2 out of 3 of the developers who responded to this survey said that less than half of their teams had received any training on the use of these tools. So you have a high rate of unauthorized use, you have a low rate of preparation, including, frankly, the definition of success, and then you compound that with a lack of training for the use of these tools, and you do, again, sort of start to create this perfect storm potential within organizations. Now, again, this is not to be a fearmonger amongst you for the use of AI Gen coding tools, and if you go back to what I said at the beginning, our perspective on Gen AI coding tools is it's not an if or a when. This is happening, and it's already happening now. It really is about the how. And so for us, the key thing here is and as we have conversations with our customers that are, in most cases, in the early stages of embracing AI coding tools, we really focus in on these 4 key recommendations. First is going back to that last data point. We highly recommend you do this in a sort of well-disciplined and process-oriented way in terms of defining a proof of concept. Understand not just the risks associated, but establish those KPIs that define your success measures. Not only is that going to help you balance the risk and the benefit perspective of what you're doing here, but it's also going to help you build towards a higher level of optimization and efficiency that you're creating within your development team through the use of these tools. The second recommendation we have is to listen intently to the application security teams as part of this process. I think that the data bears this out, as does really our experience in working with thousands of application security teams, as I said, most of whom are in some early stages of embracing AI. The AppSec teams, from our point of view, have the best balance of understanding what the security posture desire is, what is the risk appetite of the organization as it relates to innovation and application development. But frankly, they also are sitting on the front lines of seeing the results of the adoption of these coding tools and how it's negatively impacting security in many cases. So listening to that team and putting a little bit extra weight, we would say, into their inputs on this as part of that POC process is another recommendation. Related to that is we do think cross-functional input into this is vital. And so facilitating that cross-functional input and communication, again, as part of an organized POC process is key. I think another great example of that is my earlier comment on the point of view of many developers around the use of these tools, where we're seeing, and this is development leadership telling us, some of their more junior team members are getting a lot of benefits, and it's helping them sort of ramp quickly from an efficiency and productivity standpoint, whereas the more mature developers aren't really seeing the returns on this just yet. Now, look, we all know these technologies are going to improve and get better over time, but that's an important thing to have that input across those functions. And then that last piece for sure, business leadership. Make sure there's an understanding within the business leadership of how they're defining the success measures of these efforts, as well as creating heightened awareness for them of the security implications. The last recommendation we would always make is to implement what we would call guardrails around AI code adoption. Put things like SAST and other tools that are going to provide that coding and that scanning and facilitating the fixes of issues that are popping up as development teams embrace Gen AI. An undeniable aspect of Gen AI is it's going to increase the volume of code. Is it going to make code inherently less secure? There's some debates about that. There are certainly some studies that show that AI-generated code does have a higher prevalence, not only of vulnerabilities, but some of the more virulent vulnerabilities that are out there. And so, but even if that's not true, what we know is it's going to scale up the volume of code development. It's going to further put the application security teams behind the 8 ball in terms of trying to keep up. So leveraging tools that help you scale that AppSec program as a component of your Gen AI code adoption, we think is a vital part of the process. So again, those are our 4 recommendations coming off of the research. If anybody's interested, as I said, this new research we just published last week, so certainly you can grab it from our website. Feel free to email me directly. I'd be happy to send you a copy. But thank you all so much for your time and your attention today.